Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field, and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf, and a lot of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 10 minutes or so, I'll be speaking with Dr. Michael Snyder, Chair of the Department of Genetics at Stanford University School of Medicine and Director of Stanford's Center of Genomics and Personalized Medicine, about how wearables and home microsampling will be changing the face of clinical trials. But first, I'm going to give my monthly rundown on some of the late-breaking news and emerging trends that have caught my attention, including a few firsts in oncology, tailoring medications to individual patients using digital twins, the use of a simple skin biopsy test to diagnose neurodegenerative diseases, and a launch of a European-wide platform promoting access to care for all, including innovative technologies and drugs. Georgia Tech scientists are advocating for a new, more realistic approach to diagnosing cancer that provides a probabilistic statement about the likelihood of developing it, much like how cholesterol tests are used to assess heart disease risk. Probabilities are based on an individual's metabolic profile, and the first population group to be targeted are women at high risk for ovarian cancer. The focus is on the patterns seen in blood metabolic profiles that correlate with the presence of cancer in large data sets, using artificial intelligence to tease out the information. In a newly published study, which I'll link to in the show notes, the predictive model achieved 93% accuracy when tested on blood samples from hundreds of women, most active ovarian cancer patients, across 4 different geographies in the U.S. and Canada. It was particularly good at identifying early-stage disease. Researchers plan to expand their data set by an additional 1,000 high-risk patients next year. Researchers at Florida International University have developed a promising functional precision medicine approach that was recently used successfully for the first time to guide treatment of relapsed pediatric cancer patients, with 83% of children in the study showing improvement. The approach targets cancer by combining genetic testing with a new way to test individual drugs on tumor samples. To select drugs, investigators first enriched and processed cancer cells in a blood or tumor sample to mimic how they would normally grow in the body, then exposed them to dozens of FDA-approved drugs, alone and in various combinations, to identify the best cancer destroyers, a process that took about 1 week. Notably, most of the 19 participants in the study were members of ethnic minority populations who can have varying responses to medications, as we know. I'll link to the findings published in Nature Medicine in the show notes. Researchers from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory have developed a new approach to help clinics recruit more diverse populations into cancer clinical trials by analyzing the neighborhoods surrounding the 78 sites currently conducting 94% of all U.S. cancer trials, to identify nearby community health centers and hospitals they might collaborate with to expand patient recruitment efforts. The novel tool, transferable to any city with census data available, allows users to generate population maps with whatever demographics they want, and could be applied to the design of new cancer trials. The plan is to expand the analysis to other population segments and trials unrelated to cancer. You could find a link to the article in JAMA Oncology in the show notes. Elsewhere, researchers have found that only for certain types of cancer is late-stage disease a potentially better endpoint for randomized clinical trials of cancer screening than cancer-specific mortality in terms of accelerating study completion. The correlation between reduction in stage 3 and 4 cancer and reduction in mortality was weak for trials screening for colorectal and prostate cancers, moderate for breast cancers, and high for ovarian and lung cancers. The meta-analysis was done on 41 cancer screening trials conducted in Europe, North America, and Asia. The results have implications for clinical trials of multi-cancer screening tests where the use of stage endpoints could overestimate the effects on cancer mortality to differing degrees, depending on the distribution of cancer types detected. And yet more cancer-related news. A new study using patient data from a diverse range of trial sponsors and care settings finds that at least 1 in 5 people with cancer actually participate in some form of medical research, much better than decades-old estimates derived solely from government-sponsored clinical trials. The updated figure is based on an evaluation of more than 70% of people diagnosed with cancer in the U.S. across all categories of studies, including treatment trials, as well as biorepository and quality of life studies. Enrollment in cancer treatment trials sits at 7.1%, a notably higher participation rate than previous estimates of 2 to 3%, although participation rates were 5 times higher at National Cancer Institute designated cancer centers than at community sites, as would be expected. The findings, which I'll link to in the show notes, emphasize the need to offer more patients in community settings the chance to participate, which will require an investment in staff and infrastructure at these sites that currently isn't there. Researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden will be conducting clinical trials that tailor medications to individual patients with inflammatory bowel disease using digital twins. In a recently published study, they constructed computer models of patients with different autoimmune diseases by measuring the activity of thousands of different genes in each of thousands of cells in diseased tissue, and then computationally treated the twins with thousands of drugs to find the optimal one for their human counterpart. The suggested medications matched well with the results of the usual clinical treatments. Investigators have plans to build continuously updatable digital twins to aid in the prediction, prevention, and treatment of a range of diseases and are making their methods and data freely available for similar studies. Again, see the show notes for more on that front. Neurologists at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center have demonstrated the possibility of diagnosing Parkinson's and related neurodegenerative diseases with a simple skin biopsy test that detects an abnormal form of alpha-synuclein, which could help support future clinical trials for investigational drugs targeting this key biomarker. As it is, patients often experience delays in diagnosis or are misdiagnosed due to the complexity of these diseases. Among study participants with clinically confirmed Parkinson's disease, 93% demonstrated a positive skin biopsy for phosphorylated alpha-synuclein, say that twice, present in the nerve fibers in the skin. The research was part of a licensing collaboration with neurodiagnostic company CND Life Sciences. And lastly, the European Endowment Fund Health Tech for Care has launched a European Patient Observatory platform that aims to support and promote access to care for all, specifically to new medical technologies and drugs, by enabling information sharing and constructive debate among the many stakeholders involved in health innovation. Among the 4 initiatives widely recognized as best practices are a fast-track process for digital health applications in Germany that has inspired a similar approach in France, with other countries expected to follow suit. Other initiatives center on national plans, currently in France and Belgium, dedicated to rare disease patients that could help stimulate clinical research. A patient-centric clinical trial platform originating in Spain, enabling the testing of multiple treatments simultaneously for a given pathology and comparing the results to a single control arm, and systems in France and Italy for early compassionate access to innovative medicines. The first edition of this so-called European Patient Observatory, which I will of course link to in the show notes, spells out all the particulars. It is now my distinct pleasure to bring to the mic today's guest, Stanford's Dr. Michael Snyder, a leading figure in the quantified self movement, who says clinical trials as well as clinical care are poised for dramatic change thanks to the growing adoption of wearables and home microsampling. And as you will see, he has positioned himself as Exhibit A with his many N-of-1 self-monitoring experiments. Welcome to the show, Dr. Snyder.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Such a treat. So to get us started, let's be sure we're clear about what we're talking about. I think we all know what a wearable is, but not necessarily the vast variety of such devices on the market. And probably microsampling could stand to be defined to avoid any confusion. Can you give us a lay of the land on all of this?
Yeah, sure. So obvious wearables are things like smartwatches or rings that are pretty ubiquitous, meaning about 20% of the US actually, believe it or not, has a smartwatch or a ring, and they measure a lot of obvious and pretty important things like heart rate variability, skin temperature. Some of them do things like that. But there's some less well-known ones. For example, continuous glucose monitor is known by many, but not all people. They're becoming more and more popular, and they'll measure your glucose on a continuous basis. And that's really important for discovering what kinds of foods can actually set you off for give you a high glucose spike, so to speak.
Mhm.
The microsampling, and they are very, very powerful devices. We can get into that if you like. The microsampling is a fairly new area. This is, I know what's going to sound like ours actually does work, where you actually take little pricks of blood either from your fingertip or from the back of your shoulder, your back of your upper arm, shall we say, and they collect very defined amounts of volumes and using special contraptions, very, very simple to do. And you mail those in, and then we take those drops of blood and we can literally measure hundreds, if not thousands of analytes, meaning molecules in your blood from that simple drop of blood. It took us a while to work that out, but it does work. It lets you follow all your metabolites in the lab. We also follow proteins and your lipids, all these molecules that are pretty important for your health. So it's pretty cool. You can measure just from a simple drop of blood, many, many thousands of molecules that cross a wide range of things that tell you something about your health.
Yeah, you have personally broken so much new ground over the years, everything from how uniquely people age and disease arises to revelations about your own health after meticulously tracking it over the past 14 years. It's kind of hard to know where to begin this conversation. What would you most want listeners to know right out of the gate about the breadth and rationale for your life's work and what you've called the, I love this, Amazoning of healthcare?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess originally it started with biology, and now it's moving to health, where people would just study a very limited number of things important for a biological process. Or in today's world, where people, when you get measured, if you will, when you go to physician's office, they really don't make very many measurements on you, and some of them are a bit antiquated. And so what we're trying to do is transform all that. First of all, measure many, many more things, not just half a dozen key molecules. We're trying to make literally thousands of measurements. And the other is this idea of Amazonizing healthcare. A lot of measurements you don't really have to do in a physician's office. You could do at home, or you could take the samples at home and measure them in, hence the microsampling. So the point is that you can actually do a lot of this from at home. And we think that's very, very powerful because it lets, first of all, it's 10 times more convenient. People never have a convenient time to go to a physician's office. They always have to make time for it. And the other is you're measuring in a home environment where it's a little bit more natural. So we think that's pretty important when you are trying to measure someone's health. In the end, though, we think these measurements are super important because you can measure yourself then a lot more often, a lot more conveniently. You can detect illness at a lot earlier stage. And a good example is the smartwatch. We actually discovered early on, you can tell when people are getting respiratory viral infections in general from this. In fact, it's how I first got onto my Lyme diseases, because my smartwatch said my heart rate was up and my blood oxygen was down, unusually low. And so this is powerful. We've now turned this into a test that anyone can do at home, meaning you can tell 80% of the time when somebody's getting ill from a respiratory viral infection because their heart rate jumps up in advance of symptoms. It's very, very powerful, these devices, again, because they're following you. In the case of wearables, they'll follow you 24/7.
Well, yeah, that's just one of many major health discoveries I think that you've been involved in over the years. Is that correct? I think I saw a number 49. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's from this group of 9 people. Half the people learned something pretty important about their health by this deep data profiling. Like we discovered 2 people with serious heart issues, 1 person who had early lymphoma, 2 people with precancers. These are done from these various profiles, not all from the home sampling in that case, but some were actually. So one of the heart defects was picked up from a smartwatch. We've discovered a lot from this glucose monitoring. It turns out we can tell when people are having glucose dysregulation. It turns out that's very personal. Different foods spike different people's glucose. And actually, the only way to tell this right now is to actually get it measured. And so these continuous glucose monitors are super powerful for doing just that. And then, as I say, more recently, we've set up these ways of telling when people are getting ill from a smartwatch with respiratory viral infection, Lyme
Mm,
disease in my case,
right.
things like that. So these devices, they're super powerful. Again, and especially the wearables because they're tracking you 24/7.
Yeah, yeah. And I know you've predicted that trials of the future won't run the way that trials are run now and will be better for it because of this growing adoption of wearables and the microsampling. Can you elaborate a bit on this and the ways these technologies are and are not maybe ready for prime time?
Yeah, well, if you think about how we run trials now, people usually have to go to a clinic to get blood drawn, things like that. And again, it's never at a convenient time. They're usually stressed when they do it, and especially if you imagine you're running trials on mental health, they're
Mhm.
the least likely group that want to come. And also, there's a lot of groups that are underserved out there that just, they have full-time jobs. They don't have time to take off from work and participate in trials. And so the advantage of these wearables and microsampling is you can do a lot of this at home. Again, you can track people and it's in the convenience of their own house. So a lot of these measurements you do first thing in the morning where you give the samples or you can make these wearable measurements. And because it's in the comfort of their own home, A, it's convenient. B, it turns out it's low cost the way we do things. And C, it's in a natural setting. So people are less likely to be stressed by traveling to a physician's office. So we think they're going to be much better. It is early. We have to show the assays we measure from these things are pretty accurate, but I actually think they're more accurate. Some of them are more accurate, like wearable measurement. Your resting heart rate's more accurate, we believe, from a smartwatch than it is from measurement in the physician's office where people are very stressed. And yeah, and in terms of cost effective as well, they can just these are cheap assays. A smartwatch is not that expensive and probably a lot more accurate than what you're going to measure in a physician's office for some of these things I just mentioned. There's also some measurements that something called galvanic stress response, which is a fancy way of saying conductance on your skin. That you can measure from a smartwatch. They don't measure that in a physician's office, but it turns out it actually has some health benefits, meaning you can tell when people are getting dry skin, they might be getting a bit dehydrated or they might be getting diabetes. And so you can pick that up with a smartwatch. We don't measure that in today's doctor's office. So a lot of this is new. It's not clinical grade measurements. In fact, we've been using AI and such to collect information from these smartwatches to make predictions about clinical measurements. And they're not there yet in terms of clinical grade measurements, but they will be. But the power of these things for the wearables is that they're measuring you 24/7, as they say. So it's very easy to tell when someone's health shifts, meaning they shift away from their baseline. You can catch that right away. We've written algorithms to do that. And I really think that will be the future of both clinical trials and medicine. I think this idea about following people, tracking them all the time is just super powerful.
Do you have any inkling of how clinical investigators are going to feel or currently feel about whatever wearables or microsampling might be used now in clinical trials, whatever limited amount of it's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed
Yeah.
bag out there. Some, clinical investigators have really embraced this. They really like the idea of smartwatches and things. Others are skeptical. They say, well, they're not as accurate as what you measure in their office, but although the absolute measurements may be more accurate in the clinical office, the actual biological measurements are not, meaning there's this, it's well known, this white coat syndrome. When you go to a physician's office, people's heart rate jumps up,
Mm.
usually about 20 beats per minute more than they would measure it at home. So that's not really, even though the device is making an accurate measurement, the measurement itself is not very accurate. So we think again, by making, even if the device is slightly less accurate, they're usually within a few beats per minute from true values. It's still a much better measurement than you'll get in a physician's office.
Yeah.
So I think the health profession by nature is very conservative. So it takes some time to warm up to these things, but I think because it's going to be better compliance, better data, quite frankly, and more convenient and be able to reach people who are hard to reach. I think these kinds of trials will become more commonplace.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. You've talked also about the creation of personalized metrics and customized interventions that could literally transform the monitoring, detection, and evaluation of study participants to improve trial outcomes. Can you paint us a high-level picture of this utopia of which you speak?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think the power of these things for the wearables is that they measure you 24/7. So it's very easy to get a personalized baseline. And a good example is temperature. You may not realize that, first of all, our temperature when you put a thermometer in your mouth is not 98.6, it's more like 97.5. But the
Hmm.
more important point is there's a spread, meaning a lot of people, 25% of people, their baseline is 94.6. That's their healthy baseline. And if they, that's normal for them. And then if they get ill, obviously their temperature may go up, usually does. And the physician will, if they measure, the physician measures you 98.6, will tell you're normal. But if you're up 4 degrees over your baseline, you're not normal.
Mm.
We think this is really critical to know what your normal healthy baseline is. Same with continuous glucose monitors. These are super powerful devices. And we all have different baselines. But it's very easy to tell what foods are spiking you, what foods shift you up when it cause you to have glucose dysregulation, so to speak. And you can measure that with these devices. And then, we've written algorithms in the lab. I've spun off companies that are actually taking advantage of it. They'll measure what foods spike you. And they, like January AI is one of these. They have a database that basically has 32 million foods and says, look, this food spikes you, this food doesn't, eat more of these, eat less of those, and better manage your glucose. And it works. People who do this thing, they basically lose weight, they improve their glucose control. So we think this is very important. And the most important thing is personal, meaning you can see exactly what's going on for that person and then adjust accordingly. The same is true. We have something called ageotypes. We can tell people are aging by these detailed monitoring. And it turns out everybody ages differently. Some people are more cardio agers, others are more kidney agers, others are metabolic agers. And we can track that. And then from the information that comes out, in fact, we spun a company off on this called YOLO. It does a microsampling. And you would you give a little sample, one of these microsamples of your blood. They'll measure over 20 different wellness categories, and they can see whether you're older or younger. We call these ageotypes, the pattern of aging. And if you're older in some areas, it's actionable. You get information that you can act upon, change your lifestyle to improve your biomarkers in that space. So we think this is going to be very, very powerful. And in the future, what I envision is that we'll have personalized AI programs around ourselves. As you might imagine, I have one around me, so I can
Mm.
track my personal baseline with a variety of different measurements. When things shift away from that, we can flag it. And so right now we have one model out there actually for detecting COVID. We can track people with a simple smartwatch, their baselines, and when they shift away from that baseline, we can pick that up. They can get a red alert. And that tells them something's off, meaning it doesn't mean it's a respiratory viral infection. It could be. Mental health also triggers these things as well. We need more data. And when we get more data, I know we can tell the difference between mental health and respiratory viral infection. But for the moment, we can see when you're off your baseline with these personalized tracking systems. And I think that will be the future.
Yeah, wow. So, I mean, where are the easy wins? Study sponsors are no doubt overwhelmed with the options available to them, and vetting even a single device or vendor takes time and money. And then there are issues around data integration and patient acceptance and compliance that still exist today. Is there a logical, stepwise way forward that you could recommend?
Yeah, well, in toto, it is a lot. It's overwhelming to do all deep data profiles on people, that's for sure. But the easy win is the wearables, I'd say, and the continuous glucose monitoring, and even the microsampling, as I mentioned, you can do. We've spun off a company on that one, as I say, this yellow company. So they're easy wins because the data that come back are very simple. Like your smartwatch gives you this resting heart rate, something called heart rate variability. It turns out it's an important health measure that can come right back, and even you can look at that. But even if you don't look at it, I think you can integrate these things as we do into sort of an alerting system. And the way I like to think about this is like your car. Your car has usually many, many sensors on it. A race car will have 400 sensors, and they relay all that information back to a dashboard. And so you don't have to see all 400 sensors. You get simple integration as a dashboard that you can then act on. And for us, it's usually, speed, gas, and this check engine light. And it tells you when something's up, if you see something off, and then you act upon it. And that's how I see health rolling out in the future. The easy wins would be from wearables, glucose monitoring, that relays information back, makes some simple recommendations. I think AI will be very powerful for integrating data for doing this. In fact, that's what our companies do. Mm-hmm. They actually integrate information to relay it back to the participant. And so then the person can act on that in a very useful fashion. So it's complicated if you're doing the research, but it's simple when you actually get back these reports and recommendations. And I think that's an easy win. And I think by tracking people a lot more than we do today, right now we wait for people to get ill, and that's when we treat them. And what we want to do is keep people healthy. I think that's the power of this Amazonizing healthcare, if you will. It's tracking people while they're healthy to keep them healthy. So if things are starting to shift, you catch it before they have symptoms. And that's what's happened for us. These 49 people you mentioned out of 109 that were being tracked that learned something important. They were all caught these issues were caught pre-symptomatically, so they could act upon it.
Mm-hmm. So at some point, do you think we're going to need more lawmaking to prevent the growing volume of health data being collected from potentially being misused?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Right now, I don't think it has been misused in general, because I think a lot of people this data are coming in and most people don't know what to do with it. But I think it has the potential to be misused. And so obviously we want privacy laws to ensure that it is not misused. I'm a bit of an optimist. I believe that wealthy countries like the United States, we should have some minimal level of health care for our citizens. And so I think that should be a right of every citizen in this country, that you get some basic access to healthcare. And I think there should be laws to make sure that happens, meaning if something pops up from your smartwatch that says, look, you have a heart issue here, you shouldn't get that counted against that. You should actually get that, the proper care. I actually would flip this whole thing on its head. In fact, I would say you should get discounts for wearing smartwatches and things, because I think you'll actually have a healthier lifestyle. You'll walk those steps a lot more. People who do wear smartwatches, always go that extra notch to get their 10,000 steps or whatever it takes. So,
yep.
So I think we do need to change the financial incentives to make the system better for people trying to maintain their health and keep themselves healthy. And then we need laws to actually ensure that they're not abused for doing that. So I think it's a two-punch approach, if you will.
Yeah, very good. So what's next for you? I heard you have already started 17 companies that in one way or another are helping to scale your omics approach to healthcare you envision for the planet. So I'm not sure what's left to accomplish beyond continuing to model the power of the quantified self, but I bet there's more. Yes?
Oh, there certainly is. Yeah. I mean, I think we're just getting started, quite frankly. So obviously, what we do in the lab is research, and we that is what drives us there. Doing research and setting up proof of principles to show that the stuff can work, and then if it makes sense, we spin it off as a company. It's our way of trying to get it out to the world, because I think companies are good at this stuff. Academics aren't so good, but there's still some big gaps. I mentioned the financial incentives. That's not something our lab can take on. That's something that has to be done at a much higher level. But there are other areas that are totally missing that I feel like we need to do more. We're just getting started. So one is mental health. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very underexplored area. There aren't good biomarkers for it. And I think both digital and some of the omics markers could turn out to be powerful for measuring mental health. So most treatments for mental health, you may or may not know, they don't work. So people, they just flop around trying one treatment or the next to find one that works. And part of the reason they flop a lot is that we don't have good markers for knowing if they're improving. So I think this big data collection approach that we've been doing should be very, very powerful for that. Meaning, imagine having smartwatches, and we know this already, that when people are mentally stressed, they will have a shift in their baseline physiological measurements. We need to make it more precise so I can tell the difference between a mental health stress event from, say, this respiratory viral thing I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But I think we should be able to get good digital markers and biochemical markers for this. And then I think when people have that information, they can actually adopt a lifestyle that tries to minimize the things that, cause issues that might trigger, for example, bipolar or chronic fatigue episodes. And a good example there, as you may or may not know, we now know that food really is very, very important. It's known for some time, but I think even more so now that food is very, very important for your health. And one of the best treatments for bipolar disorder is a ketogenic diet. There's just a recent paper out on that. And so, controlling people's mental health by diet in some ways makes a lot of sense, or other simple things like flagging when people aren't getting good enough, or the, solid sleep is another thing. These devices can help catch that. And none of that's integrated into our healthcare system yet, but it's very, very doable. And I think that will be the future. You could put in a lot of these simple, like you say, lifestyle measurements around food, around sleep, around exercise, integrated into personal programs that should better manage people's health. And because we're all different, we have different, heart rate baselines and sleep baselines and things. I think this information is going to be really important for optimizing the personal baseline that best keeps you healthy.
Okay, that sounds great. One final question, Dr. Snyder, my favorite. When I do interviews, I often ask this, so I'm going to do it for the first time on the podcast. What is it you would most like listeners of this podcast Q&A about your deep data profiling ambitions to walk away knowing or doing?
Oh, I definitely like them to embrace knowing about their health and measuring it with smartwatches and continuous glucose monitors. I just think these are such powerful devices. And I guarantee if you wear a continuous glucose monitor, you'll never eat the same. And I know that sounds bad. It's actually good because you'll see what foods spike you. You'll see what foods don't. And you can then adjust your diet. It doesn't mean you'll eat foods you don't like. It means you'll just eat foods that are better for you for the glucose monitoring. And from the smartwatches, I'm quite confident in the future we'll be telling you when you get ill most of the time before you know it, because you'll see a shift from your baseline. So get ready to embrace these things, much like, I'll go back to the car analogy. You don't drive your car around without a dashboard, yet here we are. Most of us run around with a dashboard for our health. And I would argue your health is probably just as important, and most would think more important than your car. So I'd say get ready for it.
All right. Well, I am ready to embrace these things. I, for one, I'm sure I'm not the only one, because that sounds like a world I want to be in, where people are motivated to take care of their health because they understand their personal norms and, like you, can find problems early and fix them. This whole conversation has been fascinating to a fault, Dr. Snyder. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and making sense of what many quantified selves could mean in the big picture quest for better health and disease treatments.
Thanks for having me here. It's been a lot of fun.
It sure has been. And as always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd also be very grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. For more straight talk on studies involving humans, visit clinicalresearchnewsonline.com. And if you are a clinical research professional, we hope also to see you at our next SCOPE conference, where we make things happen. Bye for now.